Hello, everyone. This is Adrian Battle Marston, and welcome back to another episode of Deeper Dive. A few weeks ago, we had a conversation on a pretty important topic that relates to our institution and more so about higher education in general. Affirmative action is something that will be taking up a lot of the SCOTUS conversations in the next few months. And we felt as though it was important for us to contextualize this conversation to our home here at Towson. What we've decided to do is we've brought in three particular experts on this field that we think can provide some insight on how this will reflect our campus and also in ways how it will reflect the U.S. at large. We'll give them a chance to introduce themselves, and we've got some questions that we hope will be helpful for you all as our listeners.
Hello, I'm David Hawkins. I'm Chief Education and Policy Officer at the National Association for College Admission Counseling, or NACAC, where I've worked for the last 23 years.
Hello, everyone. I'm Boyd Bradshaw. I'm the Vice President for Enrollment Management here at Towson University and have been working in higher education for 25 plus years.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Moffatt, and I serve as the Assistant Vice President for University Admissions. So that covers both undergraduate and graduate admissions here at Towson University. And I've been in higher ed for about 15 years.
Thank you all so much for being here. Now, for our listeners, they may be already somewhat familiar with Boyd and Amy, but David, you are somewhat of the odd man out here. And I don't know, maybe perhaps our students would not be too familiar with what NACAC is. Can you give us a little bit of a history surrounding what that institution is and some of the work that you all sort of do?
Certainly. NACAC is a nonprofit association of school counselors and college admission officers. So basically the people who are helping students get to and hopefully through post-secondary education. We have about 26,000 members, and we've been around since 1937. Our focus, of course, is to support our members through education, advocacy, and community. And our vision is that post-secondary education is available to all who seek it. So our role in all of that is to try to educate our field, provide opportunities for everyone in the field to share information, and for us to advocate for policies and practices, particularly relevant to this conversation, that center equity and students in this whole equation.
So one of the things that we are recognizing is the role that the Supreme Court will have in higher education in the coming months. What is some of the role that your institution will play, and what is some of the implications, rather, that SCOTUS is going to have on higher ed? Because I don't know if people have spent too much time really reflecting on the implications there.
Yeah, well, the Supreme Court cases actually involving Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, both of which are being challenged for their use of race-conscious admission, is set to be a landmark decision. Since the late 1970s, the Supreme Court has pretty consistently narrowed the grounds upon which colleges and universities can consider race as a factor among factors in college admission decisions. In terms of the impact of the case, which we expect a decision to come down in the spring of 2023, I would say that there's two big categories of effects. The first is immediate. Immediate effects would affect the roughly 30% of institutions that do actually consider race as part of their admission decision making. If the court further narrows their ability to do that or eliminates or finds unconstitutional the consideration of race in admission, that would have very significant and immediate effects for those institutions. They would have to adopt new policies and ensure that they're in compliance with a new Supreme Court decision. And that's a relatively straightforward effect. It will be a big challenge. It will. I don't want to underplay the possible ramifications of that for that immediate impact, even though it is only 30% of the institutions. because they will have to significantly examine their policies to ensure that they're in compliance, but also to the second major effect, which I believe will affect all institutions. Decisions like this, and we've seen it play out in the states, California, Washington State, Florida, and Texas, all currently prohibit the consideration of race in admission. And in those states, they've had to deal with the reality that their percentages of underrepresented students have gone down precipitously since those bans were put into place. So whether or not your institution considers race in the admission decision, you will have to think much more carefully, much harder about, first of all, encouraging students of color to apply, because we've seen that the effects of decisions like the one we expect from the Supreme Court can have a chilling effect on many students, even their perceptions of being able to go to college at all or get through the admissions process. So there's going to be a lot of communication and outreach that we all need to do. But secondly, there will be a shadow cast by this decision on lots of other activities that go on at colleges and universities. One example is something as innocuous as the college essay. If your institution requires an essay, or if you ask students to list out the activities they've participated in, it's entirely possible and certain, in fact, that students write essays and list activities that say, I was the president of the Black Student Organization at my high school. What do you do with that information in a post-Supreme Court context? And of course, to your first question about how NACAC fits into this, we have argued that it's precisely that kind of thing that we cannot and really will not factor out of our decision-making processes. For some students, their race or ethnicity or gender or any other characteristic about them really defines their experience. And if we're asking them to share their life experiences with us, we can't simply ignore something as important as the color of someone's skin or their national or ethnic background. These are things that really our association has argued very forcefully that as a society, given all the inequities that we have, we cannot ignore these. And so we expect that this decision is going to create a lot more confusion among colleges and universities. And we hope to be a rudder that can help stabilize and help encourage new practices and good practices for continuing our pursuit of equity.
I want to pull in our other panelists here to see what sort of thoughts do you all have, but also with that new reality of so much responsibility sort of being placed on higher institutions now, what does that look like? And from the Towson's perspective, how do we sort of prepare for that new reality here?
Well, David, I was very impressed with how you shared that, because you're the expert in our eyes, because the National Association for College Admission Counseling is the body that kind of governs the work that we do. And I was fortunate to be on the board back in 2005. That dates me a little bit. And, and just knowing that advocacy that is going on for us kind of puts me at relief a little bit, because, my background, I've been at both public and private institutions. I've never been the enrollment leader at an institution that used race in admission decision making. And so I am on that other side of it, where, I think about the complexities of the things that we just automatically take for granted through the admission process. A lot of institutions have scholarships that are specifically for a diverse student, non-white student. There's donor scholarships. You start thinking about all the implications of this and how this might work, because those are used to attract students, a diverse student, to your institution. And so, we'll have to really think about different ways of looking at the bigger picture. Institutions, that are using race-based, they're going to be hit twice. It's going to be a little bit harder for them, but it's going to impact all of us.
For me, as a leader of a department of 40 to 45 staff members, the one thing that resonates the most is the passion and the drive for the work that we do. A lot of my staff members are in this field, higher education and admissions specifically, because they want to build relationships with students. They want to have that one-on-one connection on the road, on a virtual meeting or an in-person meeting. They want to get to know the high school counselors, their counterparts on the other side of the desk. And I think one thing that scares me, to be quite frank, is that if this decision is overturned, we won't be able to do that. Like, that could be the extreme, and that our staff will become much more transactional. It'll be much more kind of behind the scenes and just reviewing files without ever having the chance to be in high schools and be able to really build those relationships. And I think that's going to really penalize our student population, especially here at Towson University. We're a majority minority school. And the fact of the matter is that my staff is an extension of the high school counseling offices, and they're out there on the road advocating and spreading the word of when deadlines are and what the college search process looks like and talking about financial aid. And if we're not able to do that because of some of the implications that David mentioned, and again, this is kind of the extreme, but these are the things that we have to think of as leaders and directors in an admissions office. I'm really concerned about staff morale, and then also staff turnover. I mean, we've already seen this kind of huge great resignation, especially in higher education. Admissions has felt it and seen it even more. And so I worry about that even further, that if it becomes less personalized and less student-based and more transactional because of these implications that might come down, then what does that mean for our field as a whole?
Yeah. You sort of allude to some of the other topics that I think are important for people to know about, which is how did the former, I guess, or more traditional admissions process look? I guess we can sort of bring that down to the Towson level. How did that look? But something sort of changed in 2020 where we did a bit of a shift. And it sort of feels like a lot of institutions went through that during that year of 2020. Just a huge paradigm shift sort of took place that a lot of rethinking. What were some of the changes that our campus went through? But not so what, but also why did we sort of think this was the necessary time to sort of make some of those changes?
Yeah. So Adrian, if you don't mind, I'd like to take it at a higher level first, just to kind of give everyone a broad sense of traditionally how institutions have reviewed applicants in the past. And so that could be a number of factors, and Boyd and David definitely chime in here, but traditionally, transcript and school profile, kind of the rigor of courses, class rank, grade trends, SAT, ACT test scores, even down to the SAT subject exams. So really kind of that academic piece was kind of the main component with the test scores and GPA. But then also looking at extracurricular involvement, that could be with leadership, that could just be with the traditional activities, honors, awards, work experience, community service, research, internships, the college essay David mentioned. There are items or kind of criteria that some institutions have personal statements or videos or additional essays that they may require for their college or university specifically. Some do interviews. Those could be with admissions staff personally or with alumni. There's recommendation letters. There are, samples of academic work or scientific research. So I think there's a lot of components or a lot of credentials that could be looked at in an admissions process. So just giving you that framework, pre-pandemic, Towson was very much so a test score and GPA kind of operation. That was their evaluation process. We operated on a sliding scale. The higher the GPA, the lower the test score, and vice versa. And when the pandemic hit, students weren't able to take the SAT or ACT test score anymore. It was not available for the majority of the fall 2021 incoming class. So a shift really happened and it forced our hand to happen in higher education. So at Towson specifically, the shift really didn't happen until our fall 2022 class, which just came on board a couple months ago. I can't believe it's already October. And so what happened with that shift is my team, we took a step back, and because we didn't have test scores to be part of that evaluation process, we created what in the field is called a holistic review process, and that was new to Towson. So we looked at and continue to look at three main factors. So academics are the primary driver. So really looking at the rigor of the high school, or the courses that they're taking at their high school. We are looking at grade trends. So is it upward grade trend? Is it a downward grade trend? We're really looking, deeply into the student's file, and we're looking at the context of which they were at. So we're looking at the context of their high school. We're looking at the context of their environment around them. So that can give us a larger landscape to understand the student's experience more. And so that's the academic, that's the primary driver. The other two components that we look at is through the common application. That is our first year application process. And two components on the common app is the college essay. There's a few prompts that students can choose from. And so with that, we're really looking, did they answer the prompt? Is it, does it have some structure? We're looking a little bit at grammar and that aspect. So we want to make sure that we're seeing some success on the essay component of the writing ability. And then the extracurricular activities section is something that we also look into play. But since we are, test optional, I do want to let folks know that students can submit test scores. What we tell them is that it's not negatively going to impact a student's application. And just to give you a fact, only 20% of our students submitted a test score last year. So it's something that we do not need to make a decision. And we reiterate to students that are like, should I take it in? I got this score, should I send it in? And we're like, yeah, go ahead and send it in. It's not going to hurt your application. And so I think that's something that has really changed our review process and has made it more looking at the student as an individual instead of a student as a number, and has really allowed us to look more high school to high school versus even in-state to out-of-state.
Yeah, I think Amy couldn't have said it better. That test optional dynamic. One thing I want to point out that prior to the pandemic, about 1,000 institutions out of 4,000 plus in the country had moved or were moving to test optional. So, as we saw with the pandemic, some things that we always thought about, it was forced into reality. And I think we look back at it now, and, what that has allowed us to do is be more accessible for students. And it is a challenge. I mean, we jumped to 18,000 plus applications this year. The Common App dynamic and the test optional dynamic together. 18,000 applications, you're giving a lot of students an opportunity to enroll at your institution. And, that's exciting for us, particularly in the work that we do.
And I think another thing that is exciting for us with the impact of holistic review and removing test scores from our process, it really shifted who we were admitting at Towson. This year, for the fall 22 class, we welcomed more than 57% of our students identified as underrepresented, racial or ethnic minorities. So that mirrors the state of Maryland, and we're really excited to be that public institution that can serve our students. So I think that the data alone just shows the impact of kind of our shift in our review process.
It almost sounds like, and I could be completely way off base here with my assessment, while we may not be directly looking at the student's race, when we factor in that holistic approach of their school and their environment, that just naturally factors race in to some level, just by our location and their location. And that, I think, sort of leads to something I'd love to sort of pull David in on. How does sort of equity look like when it comes to higher education? And is there something higher ed institutions can consider pursuing with the potentially removing affirmative action, as how can we make sure like we're still being equitable in a way?
Yeah, that is the question of the day, really, and we actually put out a report in January of 2022 with support from the Lumina Foundation and in partnership with our colleagues at the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, which for any students listening to this, if there is an office on campus, they have an association. So there's a lot of associations in Washington, D.C., but we put out a report that essentially looked at that very question. The premise of our report was, if you had to reconstruct college admission with the goal of racial equity in mind, how would you do it, or what would you need to change? And so we went through pretty much each phase of the admission process, and we came up with 4 broad recommendations for what we could do. Number 1 is the application process itself. What are we making students do in this age of technology, where you can apply for a loan, a mortgage, you can travel all over the world without really lifting a finger. You get data sort of transferred from one place to another. You can conduct major financial transactions. Can we make the application process simpler? There's so much data locked up in high schools that could be transferred into the college admission office. Can we leverage that? So that's number 1. Number 2 was, what do we ask for in admissions, and why do we ask it? So one of the things that we have already started, in fact, is we've started to examine the different factors that we use. Amy talked a lot about rigor and about transcripts and coursework. We recently released a couple of reports in which we challenged the hegemony of calculus in math pathways. Everybody tends to think, this is very, very entrenched popular perception, that calculus is the key. You have to have calculus to be competitive in college admission. And that is true on one level because everybody believes it. But the reality is you can demonstrate mastery of mathematics in about 12 different strands of coursework that are equal to calculus in their rigor. So we want to dive down into every last thing we ask students to submit and do 2 things. Number 1, do we have the holistic view here? Are we just sort of working on autopilot and thinking, okay, if I don't see calculus, then they go to the next pile. If they got calculus, they move to the next stage. The other thing we want to do is we want to think, well, if we're asking for this, what do we do with it on the back end? A good example is standardized testing. NACAC did a study about 10 years ago where we asked colleges, if you require test scores from students, do you do research to figure out if those test scores are predictive of success at your institution? And we found that only half of institutions that required test scores actually did the research that allowed them to know whether the scores were telling them anything about the student's likelihood of success. So we really feel like that in this era, we are at a moment where it's incumbent upon colleges to bring the full weight of their academic and administrative expertise into this area to figure out, can we do this differently? The third and fourth areas are a little bit, well, they're less related to the process itself. One is making sure the admission office reflects the population you're trying to serve. We talked to a lot of students of color in this process of writing this report, and they said oftentimes that they experienced a very significant barrier of getting to an admission office or having a conversation and not having the person really understand where they were coming from. And then the final thing we talked about was we wanted to challenge the perception of selectivity at the institutional level as something that connotes institutional quality. We ask institutions point blank to ask yourselves, why are you so selective? And now, that's a relatively small number of institutions because the average acceptance rate in the U.S. is for 4-year colleges is 65%. So we're talking about the influencers to use modern lingo, the influencers in the college admission space. Why is it necessary, particularly at public flagship institutions, that you're selective? And can we rethink that? So there's a lot to dig into in those areas where if the Supreme Court eliminates the consideration of race in admission, We've got all of those areas and more because we haven't even scratched the surface on the K-12 side of the equation either. But that's a different conversation.
I think that sort of opens the door to another important question that I really would want to pose to all three of you, honestly. We've talked a little bit about testing in the admissions process, but what are some of the other barriers that we all have become aware of over the last, let's say, 3 to 4 years in the higher ed admissions process that I think we need to consider more with affirmative action potentially being removed? And Boyd, we can start with you if you had any thoughts.
I'm going to take this a little bit different direction, because one thing that is a barrier is cost. And, and a lot of students will think through costs and apply it to admission, and, they're very separate. But at the same time, students are being discouraged more, with today's economy, high inflation, our costs are rising, as institutions. There's not enough free money, federal aid available, and students are resistant to taking out student loans. Back in the day, there was no problem taking out a loan. And, but now they're having to take out more dollars. And, am I going to get the right job so I can pay this back? And so I think one of the things that we have to do a better job in the work that we do is how do we connect the cost side of it to the admission side, even though they're very separate, because they're not even applying because of that barrier of what is it going to cost me, can I afford?
Well, even on that, the cost to the investment piece, right? Like you said about it, I hear it every time that we're on the road and my counselors are advocating, financial barrier. This is what we always hear on the road. And how do we, as a whole, not as Towson University or not even as colleges and institutions, but as an organization and as a nation, really, is how do we show that taking out a loan for higher education is okay, right? Like, people will take out loans for cars, for a home, but whenever it comes to taking it out to pay for education, it's this completely like hands up, no, like I can't take out a loan. And so how do we re-educate the public? I think you said it, like, 10, 15 years ago, it was a no-brainer. Like, when I went through college, I didn't know there was anything but loans, So I think that's where we have to do a better job about educating that a loan is okay as long as it's a manageable amount, because this is an investment. And I think that's hard because financial is such a sensitive topic, and we all know that we're not getting more money from the government. If anything, it's diminishing our state appropriations, and we have such a limited budget for the financial aid and scholarship side of the house. And so who gets the money is always the biggest question that we have to deal with. And so I think it's interesting. The cost is that's the number one barrier. I think we all can agree on that. I think the other barrier that I run into, especially in the state of Maryland with some of our counties, is how large the high school senior class is. There might be 500, 600, thousands of students that are graduating or in the senior class, and then they only have 1 or 2 high school counselors. So I know NACAC did a great study a few years ago that they found that 1 to 470 was the student to counselor ratio, and the study showed that it should be 1 to 250 students. And so that's what we see a lot in our state, is that there's just not the resources at the high school level to help these students through college search. So, we're lucky, I think, especially in Baltimore County and Baltimore City, that we have a lot of community-based organizations that will help students through this process. Obviously, there's a lot of colleges and universities in our little corridor that also, that's our job to help them through the college search process. But I know that is one of NACAC's big initiatives on the government relations side. It's things that we advocate every year is, just how do we get more resources in the high schools so that students know about the college search process and the financial aid opportunities that are out there, and help with that message of the value of education and that it is an investment.
Yeah, and in fact, I think we were planning to talk about this a little later, but since Boyd and Amy have brought up this elephant in the room of the cost of college, absolutely that is one of the biggest barriers that we face, pre or post Supreme Court. And one of the things that NACAC did a couple of years ago is we put out a report in which we re-envisioned higher education as a public good. So we want to think decades down the line here. And the sooner we can do this, the better, of course. But everybody just sort of takes it for granted that a public K-12 education is free and accessible to all. Yeah. Why aren't we moving towards higher education in that way? Why don't we see it that way? Our world has changed. The skills that we need to survive economically as both individuals and as collectives have only gotten more complex. So why are we not thinking about providing a free option for students to go to college? That's the future we'd like to see. Until we get there, we have to do a better job of making it affordable as it stands. Amy, to your point about loans, there have been a lot of great programs that we've advocated for, not only to help educate students about the money that's available to them, but also the programs that we've helped institute at the federal level to allow students to pay back loans using only a fraction of their income. We call it income-driven repayment processes. So we've got a big, audacious goal in the future, and we have some interim goals that we'd like to see. And the last thing that I'll just simply add and emphasize is that a lot of what we'll be talking about today is, in fact, in our higher ed admissions space. But that K-12 access issue is critical. And for those who are maybe in that space or who have one foot in each, as we do here at NACAC and tend to do in admissions offices, the equity issues that we face in school funding, in access to coursework. We talked about calculus earlier. Only 50% of public high schools offer calculus. So right there you can see the equity issue off of the starting line, really. And then finally that assistance in helping to guide students into post-secondary education is critical. And we've actually gotten research that demonstrates how effective it is when you have someone working one-on-one with you.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that we've sort of heard that Towson sort of shifted to in the last few years. But are there any other trends that we've sort of noticed across the country that is important for other higher institutions to be made aware about? And Boyd, we can start with you on this one.
Yeah, it's interesting because as we think back prior pandemic, we were all worried about that word enrollment cliff. Yeah. And the shift in the students pursuing education is going to be drastic for all of us. And, fewer students graduated from high school. The mix of those students are changing, as institutions. We're seeing a large increase in our Latinx and Hispanic students throughout the country. Many of us institutions are not ready for that. It takes other resources, as you bring other types of students to your campus. And then the pandemic hit. And I think now we're all starting to think back, okay, we also have this enrollment cliff because the pandemic has also caused fewer students to go to college. And so we were hit twice. And we're starting to see that really right there in front of us in today's environment. The thing how that impacts Towson, the state of Maryland is not seeing a decrease like we are seeing in the other states. What happens, though, other colleges will come into Maryland and recruit our students. And so we have to be, on our game, and to really encourage students why they should stay in state. Why going to a state public institution in the state of Maryland, they will benefit from that rather than going out of state. And we're also seeing other universities providing additional financial aid to attract students out of state. So those are some of the challenges that we're facing.
I think another challenge is we've been talking a lot about our freshmen, our first year population, and another big challenge for Towson specifically is we're 40% transfer students. And when the pandemic hit, transfer enrollment declined by like 26% from the years 2011 to 2019. And then from 2020 to now, it's been like 10 to 15% more. So there's already been this like enrollment decline with transfer students, and then the pandemic elevated it even more. And so we're worried about that pipeline. The students who are not going to our Maryland community college partners, how do we, even on the high school recruitment side, do we just even take a step back, and are we recruiting for education as a whole, like college education, like just to get them thinking about the value of higher education, and that there are more than one options to getting into, getting a college degree. And so whether that's going to one of our amazing community colleges in the state, or if it's coming directly to us, I think we have to be able to shift like our recruitment strategies. I'm seeing that a lot more, and I'm talking a lot with our peer institutions, especially in the Baltimore area. How do we partner to really make higher ed a bigger factor? Because a lot of students, even though the state of Maryland has high school graduates, they may not be college going graduates. So I think that's something that is very top of mind and keeps us up at night.
One thing I just want to mention really quickly is in regards to transfer students. I had the opportunity yesterday to attend the inauguration of Prince George's new president. And she spoke for about 90 minutes on just the environment of education. And it was really uplifting, because one of the things that many of the community colleges are looking at, it's not just getting the student the job, which used to be a big focus. It's 4-year success, 2 years at the community college associate's degree, move on to 2 years bachelor's degree, and those pathways. And they're really focused on that, which to me is exciting, because, we can work together, Towson University and our community college partners, to make sure that students are successful. And that's one of the big focus areas that we are focused on. We're trying to actually build the infrastructure in the team and provide more resources to recruit transfer students that are wanting to start at a community college, get that associate's, and then transfer on for their bachelor's.
We've got our last question here, and David, we can pose this to you. And you've sort of alluded to this earlier on, but it's about rethinking public education as a public good. How do we even begin to approach that? Some of the things that we talked about in the original conversation was the polarization that a lot of Americans have when it comes to considering race in anything. And to consider public education as a public good, you kind of have to consider factors like race. How do we approach that? And what is some of the work that you all have started doing to really open that conversation?
Yeah, Adrian, you raise a terrific point there, because one of the long-term trends that we see and have to keep in mind in all of this is that the great irony of the sort of the depleted funding of higher education is that it started to decline just as we were starting to make gains in equity around the 70s. And in the 80s, we really started to view higher education as a private good, where we were shifting more of the financial burden of paying it onto the students in the form of loans. Whereas in the 1960s, when we passed the Higher Education Act, we envisioned that as a country that you could go to a public 4-year college using a Pell Grant that would cover your tuition and fees. So needless to say, that hasn't panned out. So we consider that this debate, this national discussion about higher education as a public good, is one that is part and parcel of the equity discussion in our country. And to our, I think to our benefit, the conversation has started. We've started talking about free 2-year college programs. We've even started to hear talk of free public education in some states. But it is going to require a shift in our public mindset. And one of the things that NACAC wants to do, first of all, we want to do the policy advocacy. We want to be there in Congress at the state level, telling legislators just how important higher education is. Not only does it help individual students who graduate and go and get jobs and become taxpayers and folks who have health care. It also makes them part of stronger communities. It makes them feel more, have more efficacy in their lives. And those benefits, when you start talking about tax funding, you talk about reduced funding for social support programs, you start, reduced funding for prisons, that is a public benefit. Higher education institutions themselves, like Towson, have immediate economic impacts in their communities. So this is what we are trying to convince Congress of, and state legislators. The other thing that we want to do is we want to talk to people about why these benefits are important to them. Our CEO was out in Wyoming last year and asked a college admission vice president out there, who is your biggest competitor, thinking that the answer was going to be some other institution. She said the trucking companies. Really? They give our students, our high school graduates, jobs for $60,000, $70,000 right out of high school. So compare that to taking out loans to go to 4 years of college for an uncertain outcome, and you start to see the economic challenges that we're facing. So we're trying to open the conversation up so that people don't see higher ed as just the ivory tower. We want it to be anything beyond high school, and we want to be able to support any student that desires access to education beyond high school. And that, to me, is the great, at least from an educational standpoint, the great sort of social issue of our time in this
David,
industry.
you just made me think of a partnership that we have at Towson University with Amazon. Amazon is also recruiting students right out of high school, but there's a partnership where they start at Amazon. Amazon will pay up to, I think, $5,500, I might be a little off, for the student to go to college. And we've partnered with Amazon to make that process seamless. And I think you're going to see more and more of that. It goes exactly to your point, David, on what you were talking about.
David, Boyd, Amy, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And if you all would like to know more about this conversation, feel free to check out in the comment section and the links below, and feel free to contact us if you have any other questions. With that, thank you all again, and take care.